In this video, we will talk about the Synoptic Gospels. Over the past 2 weeks, you've read the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. You probably noticed as you read that you're reading some of the same stories over again. There are a lot of similarities among these 3 texts. This is what scholars have referred to as the synoptic problem. Synoptic is Greek and literally means to see or view something together. In this case, what we are viewing together is these 3 Gospels. We notice many similarities in these Gospels. For example, we see the story of Jesus walking on water in the Synoptic Gospels. Many claim that this is because they are eyewitness accounts, that everybody sees an event differently from somebody else. However, we need to remember that the Gospels do not claim to be eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. So this explanation really does not help us solve the synoptic problem. The solution that most scholars have come to solve the synoptic problem is the 4-source hypothesis. So as you've read the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of Luke. And you probably noticed that Mark is relatively straightforward and to the point. There's little excessive language in the Gospel of Mark. However, Matthew goes into more detail and talks more about fulfillment of prophecies, and Luke's Gospel is even more flourishing and talks about how Jesus fulfills Roman history and Hebrew Bible prophecy. Because of the similarities and because of the earlier date of Mark, and how Mark's Gospel is straightforward and to the point, but Luke and Matthew add on to it, most scholars argue that Mark was actually a source for the Gospels of Matthew and of Luke. Now, another thing you might have noticed, if you were reading the Gospels these last couple weeks, is that the stories we see in Mark are not the only stories we see in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. For example, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but not in the Gospel of Mark, we see the Beatitudes, Jesus' temptation, and the Lord's Prayer. Because of this, most scholars argue that there was an additional source that Mark did not have, but that Luke and Matthew both had. This is referred to as the Q source. So the Q source is believed to have provided a lot of the information that both Matthew and Luke drew off of, but Mark did not have information of. Now again, there is more information that we see in Matthew that we do not see in Mark and also do not see in Luke. While Matthew may have come up with this on his own, most scholars argue that there was an additional source or compilation of sources, which they refer to as M, which provided some of the background for Matthew. Similarly, for Luke, we see some stories that we do not see in the Gospels of Mark or in Matthew, and this is referred to as L. This is a lot of letters. To put it in more concrete terms, let's think about writing a research paper. Now, say that you wrote a research paper. You used the information that you were taught in class, and you wrote a research paper about the American Revolutionary War. Now, 2 other people in your class saw your paper and decided to copy it for their own research paper. So, for ease, we're going to call your friends Matthew and Luke. Matthew copies your paper, and Luke copies your paper, but both of them also have read another textbook that helps them write an even better research paper. So your friend Matthew expands on the paper that you already wrote by adding some of these other sources from this textbook, and so does Luke. But Matthew also read a novel about the American Revolutionary War from the perspective of a British historian. So Matthew decides to incorporate that in his research paper. Luke, on the other hand, read a novel about an American who is reflecting on the Revolutionary War and incorporated that into his research paper. All of these research papers are going to have a similar idea, very similar stories, but some of them are going to have more information than the one that you wrote did. Now, we're not arguing that the authors of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke plagiarized the Gospel of Mark, but this was common practice in this time period. What we do want to note is that the Gospel of Mark seems to provide most of the text that we see in Matthew and Luke, and the rest of it is often split between Matthew and Luke but not found in Mark, suggesting that there is another source. This diagram here explains the relationships among the Synoptic Gospels. What percentage of them is found in the other Gospels as well? As you can see, the Gospel of Mark provides a lot of the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. We also have other source material out there that seems to be unique to Luke or to Matthew, as well as this double tradition in dark blue, which would be the Q source. Now, we mentioned the Q source earlier, and this name comes from the German word for source, which is Quelle. We do not have the Quelle source. We do not have this Q source out there. This is simply a hypothesis, but scholars found the Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of sayings of Jesus. Now, this Gospel of Thomas is not canonical and does not necessarily contain or is the Q source, but it suggests that this idea of a Q source out there that contains Jesus' sayings and teachings does exist. We also have the M source and the L source, as we mentioned earlier, which is the Matthew source and the Luke source. And when we talk about how Matthew and Luke use the Gospel of Mark as well as the Q source and their other source materials to create their Gospels, we're talking about redaction or editing. Redaction is a process, and there's a few different ways that this happens, by which somebody takes a text and edits it in a way to make it fit their own needs. One of these ways is through addition. For example, with the text of Matthew, Matthew draws on the Hebrew Bible tradition more so than the other Gospels do, and adds the verses from the Hebrew Bible to explain how Jesus fulfills Hebrew Bible prophecy. We also see omission. Some writers will omit certain elements of the text because they are just simply not needed for what the point they're trying to get across is. Some writers might reorder the text. For the most part, these three Synoptic Gospels follow the same order, but there are some variations among them. Some authors might abbreviate the text and shorten passages that are longer in other sections. And some of it might simply be rephrasing a text. So let's take a look at the Synoptic Gospels next to each other for a sample passage. In all three Synoptic Gospels, we find the story of Jesus healing the leper. Well, let's start by reading the middle section, which is from the Gospel of Mark, since it's the oldest version, and probably the source for the Matthew and Luke version as well. So the author of Mark writes, "A leper came to him, begging him, and kneeling. He said to him, 'If you choose, you can make me clean.' Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, 'I do choose, be made clean.' Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean." Now notice here that some of the language is a bit choppy, especially the beginning. A leper came to him, begging him, and kneeling, he said to him. For the most part, Mark is straightforward and to the point. Now let's look at Matthew, since it's probably the next written gospel. When Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And there was a leper who came to him and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean." He stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Now some of this phrasing is exactly the same as we see in Mark, such as the very ending, immediately his leprosy was cleansed. The quotation is the same, except Matthew adds the word Lord. However, the beginning part is different. There's a focus on Jesus coming down from the mountain, and more of a transition. What we see in both Matthew and Luke is a focus on smoothing out some of Mark's language. Mark often uses something we call parataxis, which is simply short, unrelated phrases. Mark moves from one thing to the next without necessarily explaining how they are related. Matthew and Luke smooth out some of this rather elementary Greek language to make it flow better and smooth it out quite a bit, and explain how things are related, such as Jesus coming down from the mountain. Now let's take a look at the Gospel of Luke. Once, when he was in one of the cities, there was a man covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean." Then Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him. Luke adds quite a bit more to his version of this story than Matthew even does. Luke's language is often flourishing and tries to smooth out what's going on in the Gospel of Mark. What we can see here is a lot of these similarities among the passages. Some of them have the exact same phrases, but they also add details that the original source in Mark does not have. So we've talked about the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But what about the Gospel of John? This is also a New Testament canonical gospel, but we do not consider it part of the Synoptics. Well, there's a few reasons for this, and this is something that most or many scholars argue, but within the last couple decades there's especially been a movement to consider John part of the Synoptic Gospels, arguing that there is more in common with the three than most people think. For the most part, the mainstream perspective is that John is not part of the Synoptics, and there are a few reasons why. The first of these is that John is focused on explaining Jesus' nature and the nature of discipleship. The focus is not necessarily on telling about Jesus' life and how he became a teacher, and his crucifixion and so on, but rather on explaining who Jesus is. Similarly, the focus of John seems to be more on the theology, or what Jesus' teachings are, rather than Jesus actually giving the teachings. And finally, there's simply events that are not in John that are in the other Gospels. Some of these are the event where Jesus walks on water, for example. While some people do consider John part of the Synoptics, this is probably the mainstream view at this point, that John is an additional, yet canonical New Testament gospel that does not work with the source material we have for the other Gospels. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain what the synoptic problem is, identify and explain the sources in the four-source hypothesis, describe the relationship among the synoptic Gospels, and explain how redaction occurs, specifically how it occurs in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke.